Thank you for coming to our presentation. We are 11th Hour. I'm Katie Barnett. This is Julie Zilkowski, Vinnie Hornbach, and Billy White. And we are all seniors on the animation track in CGT. This semester we are studying the accelerated rendering of fur. CG Films have been using fur to render for years in fun and sometimes realistic ways. For us, as CGT students, it's always seemed kind of intimidating. Our professor, Ray, who's also our sponsor, has mentioned that fur is often avoided because it seems to be too complicated to use. So this semester, our goal was to find a way to make Maya fur more available to render so that undergraduate students, and anyone else who wants to use fur and create furry creatures will feel more confident in their abilities to render it out. We kind of had a leg up this semester. All four of us worked together last fall in a class called CGT 341, in which we created an animation from scratch. It was about 2.5 minutes, and our main character was a sheep. There were also a bunch of other sheep. There were scenes with fields of sheep. We had no interest in using fur. As I said, it seemed really intimidating to us. So we were going to use a 3D object. It turned out we were encouraged to, push our boundaries and try something new. So we ended up using fur. Things went pretty smoothly until it came to render time. We set up the rendering as we would normally before we had ever tried fur, and clicked render, let it go. Our scenes were taking upwards of 40 minutes to render. We didn't understand how the render settings we were using were affecting the fur, and we didn't know how to make a more efficient render time so we could get our project done. This led to us, looking around the internet, trying to figure out what's the best way to render fur. And we found some different suggestions, but rendering the fur faster sometimes took away the quality from the rest of the film. In the end, our solution ended up being passes that we could use. So you render out the fur on its own separate layer from the rest of the animation. So we would render out the fur in one layer, the shadow layer by itself so that it could show the form of the fur, and then we'd composite it with the rest of the image to make our final animation. This ended up being maybe total about 4 minutes a frame, so we were saving a lot of time. It was a good solution for that semester. We finished our animation on time. It looked all right, but it's not something that we would want to put on our demo reels or show to a prospective client, because the fur is kind of blown out and it doesn't have any self-shading. So this semester, one of the biggest questions we had to ask ourselves is, what is quality fur? Quality fur is primarily a subjective thing to talk about. It's hard to say, how can one person say that the fur in Rise of the Planet of the Apes is better or worse than the fur in Ratatouille? You could definitely make the argument that the fur in Rise of the Planet of the Apes is more realistic, but they weren't going for realism in Pixar's movie, and quality doesn't equal realism. So fur is being used as a certain style in these movies to build a world. We want to determine how you can say that the quality is better in something. We were corresponding with Matt Brisbane of the Industrial Advisory Board, and he encouraged us to pay attention to the visual performance of the fur, so look at things like self-shading and density to determine if what you're creating is good. So this semester, our new goal was to determine a way to make what we started on last semester better quality. We wanted more self-shading in the fur without sacrificing a lot of render time. We're focusing primarily on giving this to low-budget solution, people who don't have a lot of extra money to spend on render farms and things like that. But we also wanted to look at, we're using Mental Ray right now because it's integrated with Maya, but there are other render engines available out there, and maybe one of them will do the job better with less hassle. So we looked up, forums and things on CG Society to see what people thought about which render engine would work best for fur. And while we were looking, we determined that there are a multitude of conflicting opinions when you're looking at render engines for fur. Everybody seems to have their own opinion, and that's just what it is, an opinion. So we wanted to create a study in which we could compare render engines specifically towards fur, while keeping in mind something that Peter Maxim of RenderMan Sales told me, which is comparing renderers is like comparing apples to carrots. Both can be organic and grown in or above the ground, but they're vastly different ingredients when you're making something in the kitchen. So while the settings may appear to be the same across render engines, when you render them out, because they're being computed differently, they could give you different times and results.
So this brings us to the question, what is a render engine? A render engine is a piece of software that renders out a CG scene or an image. But then what's a render? According to Jeremy Byrne, a lighting technical director at Pixar, the 3D rendering process depicts a three-dimensional scene as a picture taken from a specified location and perspective. A finished rendering is made up of many parts, as you can see on the picture on the far side. The many parts include but are not limited to a base model, flat color, textures, and shadows and any lights. To create this image, one needs a render engine. And render engines can come integrated into large animation packages, stand alone as separate copies, or be found online as open source projects. We chose to include 4 different render engines in our study. The first render engine is MentalRay. This was an obvious choice for testing since it comes integrated with Autodesk Maya, the program we used for our testing. It can produce high quality renders and excels at realistic reflections and refractions. It is the least expensive of our 4 render engines. Our next render engine is Pixar's RenderMan. It is industry proven since it's been used in 13 of its feature-length films. And it is known for its fast render times, even when rendering fur, which takes complex algorithms and shading to compute. V-Ray is the newest edition of V-Ray, was released 2 years ago and is quickly gaining popularity due to its ability to produce high-quality images. While it is used extensively in renderings for architecture, this engine has a growing hold in the video game and the film industries. It is the most expensive of the render engines that we have. And last but not least is Maxwell. Maxwell was recommended to us as the final render engine that we should test. It has a photorealistic lighting system and the ability for quick scene setup. We decided in the end not to test with it because it does not render fur by default. You need separate extra software to be able to render fur. But the opinion of several individuals on the site CG Society was that the same results that Maxwell produced could be achieved using MentalRay, provided that you could adjust the settings properly.
All right, here's an example of our testing scene. We have our ball with our fur. We gave it a mouse preset, everything's set there. We have one directional light, which will cast the shadows on the fur. We have a point light off to the side, and that'll help lighten up the other side of the fur so it's not dark. And you can actually see what's going on without blowing it out. And then the base is it helps catch the shadows, so you can see the shadow quality better. So the first test we did, we just took it, didn't change any of the default settings for the fur, and hit render. The rate tracing in MentalRay took 3 minutes and 15 seconds. RenderMan took 1 minute and 4 seconds. Huge difference with no additional changes. We also used our passes method, and that got us to about 2 minutes and 2 seconds. V-Ray, we attempted to use it, but there's one thing about V-Ray. It does not support Maya fur. So it doesn't use the same presets. The length and density are adjusted differently. So it's hard to get it to look exactly the same as the others to compare it that way. And it had some presets. You have to assign its own shader to it. There's a lot more in-depth things you could do with V-Ray, but you have to learn its fur system instead of just using Maya's. We also decided to test the density. So, in the original test, we had it at 50,000. This one, we moved it down to 5,000 to see how the different render engines would, calculate it. Mental ray with ray tracing took 2 minutes and 22 seconds, while RenderMan took 20 seconds. Our passes method didn't save us too much time in this one, and with a time of 2 minutes and 5 seconds. However, when we upped it to 500,000, our mental ray tracing took 5 minutes and 34 seconds. RenderMan took a lot more time this one, up to 5 minutes and 24. Whereas our passes method was able to calculate the density a little faster and brought it down to 3 minutes and 47 seconds. Another test we did was length, to see how the shadows would be calculated and how the different sizes of length would render in each render engine. For this, originally was at 0.5. We moved it down to 0.1. The mental ray with ray tracing took 2 minutes and 15 seconds. RenderMan back down again to 32 seconds. And then the mental ray with the passes was at 1 minute and 58 seconds. When we upped the length to 1, mental ray took 4 minutes and 52 seconds. RenderMan went up to about, minute and 50 seconds. And the passes, we were able to get it down to 2 minutes and 34 seconds. Our new solution for our passes from the previous semester was that we added depth map shadows to the fur. They don't take too much longer to calculate. They're not the best looking if you're doing it on every object in the scene, but when you're self-shading the fur, it worked pretty well. The bottom picture is the scene of how we used to do it, which looks significantly different from the top one, but the time isn't that much different. Maybe a couple seconds, 5 to 10, depending on the scene.
All right. After testing was completed, we created 2 separate products. The first of which is a step-by-step guide showing our mental ray passes method. And it goes through each step very carefully for novice Maya users, so there's no room for error. We used snapshots of the settings, so it would be easier to follow along with. And this will be posted next week on our website, and it'll be on the G Drive for CGT students. And then our second product was an animated short. We really wanted to display the difference between the render engines by creating a quick animation. We were inspired by Luxo, the lamp, and Luxo Jr. from Pixar. It's an easily recognizable logo. So we wanted to do something similar with that using our own characters and our logo. So we created a character called Zero, and we used a fennec fox, which is just a normal animal. And during the pre-production phase, we created reference images and storyboards to help us visualize what the final animation was going to look like. During production, we created the models, applied the textures, created the various rigs that needed to be created, and set up the full scene over here. And finally, here is our first render. This is using the mental ray passes method. Then the next video shows the 3 separate, it shows mental ray, the mental ray passes, and RenderMan all at once on the screen. Final thoughts. Every render engine has its strengths. As we said, Mental Ray excels in reflections and refractions. But Mental Ray, the idea is that if you know enough about the software, you can basically do anything else any of the other render engines can do. It just has a much steeper learning curve. And any principles or solutions you find in Mental Ray can usually be applied to other render engines or will assist you in learning a new one. We would also like to thank Ray, our sponsor, Professor Burton, Peter Moxham from Pixar Marketing, Matt Brisbane from the Industrial Advisory Board, and all of you for showing up today.
Now we'll open it up for questions.
Yep.
What were some problems that you encountered when you were going through testing?
Besides V-Ray being a lot longer to render out, a lot of it, I had some time differences from a couple tests, which I just redid them and they were consistent after that, but it was like maybe 30 seconds difference from the first time I had done it. I don't know if it was, I don't know what caused it, but I basically had to redo most of the tests so they were consistent time-wise.
I assume that for different render engines that settings had different names than from render engine to render engine. How do you deal with that?
They weren't too different. Like RenderMan keeps all like the regular settings for like the fur. You don't have to change that. The render settings, it has shading quality, which is a little different in Mental Ray, but RenderMan explains what each one does. It was actually really nice.
RenderMan was really nice because they had a nice interface. If you weren't quite sure what was going on, they helped you get to what settings you needed to do, which wasn't quite the same in V-Ray.
Yeah.
Was that because of interaction with the sales rep?
No, the software is.
Yeah.
You just
Like
think
you
it's
would
fine
highlight,
to-
like move the mouse over the like shading quality, it would tell you.
So you had no formal instruction or help learning how to do that?
No, we didn't.
No.
We wanted to make sure that we were going to be as even between the render engines. Mental Ray, obviously, we understood most of it already, but RenderMan and V-Ray, we hadn't. What we did was look at tutorials, kind of familiarize ourselves with it, but we weren't more familiar with RenderMan than we were with V-Ray.
Why were you intimidated with fur? I want to understand that. Is it mean and nasty or what?
Well, if you've seen Monsters, Inc., the first one,
Sure.
you'll notice that only like 2 or 3 characters have fur on them the whole
Right.
time. And from what we learned from Pixar, the rep was that they tried to avoid using fur as much as possible because of the astronomical render times. But since technology's changed, they've been able to incorporate more fur in their movies. But for us, with Mental Ray, in 341 we mentioned that it had really long render times. One scene with 20 characters, I think, took 4 hours to render a single frame. And playing at 24 frames per second, that's not feasible when you have to 1 week to render out all of your footage.
I'm a little curious about how quality plays into this too. You know, I noticed the differences in the imaging up there. It at times was pretty dramatic that Mental Ray probably wasn't doing as well as another version. So are you accepting your method of multiple passes versus using RenderMan? Or are you rejecting it? What are you saying?
We're accepting it because we determined a way to get shading onto the fur. We think it looks pretty nice in comparison, especially considering the drastic render time difference.
Well, you know, in your animation, we appear to be about 1.5 miles from these characters. So detecting for me was very difficult until you zoomed in at the end, and then it looked okay. And the fox was not fur, right? So Okay, so,
I guess we were kind of doing the animation more as a study of, putting a lot of furry creatures on the screen.
To
Can
see
we
what the
handle
passes
rendering
were.
it?
okay.
And how different is it going to be?
So I guess I'm trying to understand where the quality issue comes in. I understand the quantitative analysis, this one does fur, that one does fur, has so many, follicles and, all that stuff. I understand that. But there appears to me to be a qualitative difference that I'm old, I can't see, so is that the problem, or am I missing something?
They look different, definitely. You're not missing that. I guess that's one of the things we're trying to say is that, Mental Ray versus Render Man in our animation, it's hard to say that one was better quality than the other. They were both
Why don't you
giving
bring it up?
shadows to them. We're getting shadows on both of them. They have shading between the fur. We're getting the shadows in the background. So
Not that.
Do you want to see the
want the
test?
test?
Yeah, but show the test, because that's where when you look at that, that's the 1.0, but where's the one that's, whoa, there you go. There appears to be a qualitative difference to me. There really does. And so, even though time-wise, it doesn't look like there's you're saying your method's more effective, but is it as nice a fur? So perceptually, where do you draw that line? Where one is good or one is not as good? And maybe it doesn't make any difference, I don't know.
It depends on the world you're trying to create, really.
That's what you were saying at the beginning.
Yeah, like, yeah, so if we were going with something realistic, then we want more realistic fur.
Okay, so I'm gonna put one of these in my portfolio. I'm not putting them in right. I mean, if I look at these three up there right now, and I'm trying to show someone that I know how to do fur, there looks to me to be a qualitative difference.
well, we were focusing on people who didn't have as much, students who don't have access to as many tools maybe, or don't have as much time. They don't have large render farms to do this. So it's more important to them than, large companies to save time. That's something that's important.
But isn't there a qualitative assessment of your portfolio? I mean, don't people look at it and say, oh yeah, they did a good job? Okay.
Right.
Okay.
That's why we're hoping to find an alternative solution that would give you quality that you would be proud to put in your portfolio while saving you time on the side, I guess. Are you saying you don't think we did that?
Well, no, I'm trying to say, what is the emphasis? And if I'm trying to hire you, and you're saying that you know how to do this, what basis am I using for that hire? Is it, it's really good looking fur? And then within that hierarchy, where does the time come in to create that? And the render man, with the exception of this comparison right here, was pretty much faster, right? Isn't that a fair statement to say?
Yeah.
So then I guess the next question is, don't we have render man here?
No.
No.
Oh, okay.
Now we go.
So there's the rub, right? Okay. Where did you have that done?
We talked to RenderMan sales team, Peter Moxon. He gave us a temporary license to use specifically for our testing.
Cool. Can you publish out of it? Put it in your portfolio before it goes down?
I don't believe it's specifically for the testing.
But wouldn't a dialogue relative to your process of what you're trying to do be something pretty important? And what were the other densities that you were dealing with? Yeah, see, okay, so look at something like this. See, I think this, the quality is fairly similar. Maybe, once again, I can't see well, but I think if you would show render man for whatever it was, and then show your middle ray, and then do, in your portfolio, do an emphasis on the development of this multi-pass process to reduce that time, that you get to be very attractive as an employee.
The advantage was the time savings on the other one, where it was pretty obvious that it wasn't quite the same quality. Your render man was only 20 seconds.
Right,
So
right.
maybe selling this one, hey, we come up with something that takes 6 times as long. Maybe that's not a good sales point. I don't know.
If the assessment is your ability to produce a quality image, is time the variable,
Right.
right?
Whatever
And what I'm
it was.
saying is you have two ways to go on this. One of them is about your technique that you developed, and the other one is about, hey, I know what this should look like. And somewhere in there, I think there's a manager, somewhere,
Yeah.
to make that decision. So that's what my question is. I think you're onto something really cool here. I just think there, you know, needs to be able to work a little.
These tests are done on one computer?
Yes, we used just one computer to make sure that wouldn't affect the differences.
Well, in terms of your goal to make it easier for students, how many Maya machines are in the lab?
In Noy, there's a Maya license on every computer on the third
For
floor,
4, I believe.
which is where
Okay.
So
CDC students usually have
there's-
their classes.
And we can lasso them all together into a render farm?
Unless you wanna make a whole bunch of.
Have a bunch and start
Like last semester, we took over, I think, 2 labs, rendering out our project in the final week, just to get everything done on time, because we didn't have access to a render farm.
If we did it, it would be deleted the next semester. It'd be a lot of work.
So this was done like on a desktop, not like on the servers and like 346 or something?
It was his personal desktop.
Okay, did you do any comparisons to like, isn't there a server in there set up for rendering, so you click on it, that was Morales's?
In 346, when we went,
One of the computers Russ Morales has, so we have a server for that, I believe, doesn't he? So did you do any comparisons to the speed on that, or how much longer it takes that?
we were only given 1 Pixar license to begin with, so we had to choose 1 computer to use. Yeah, I guess we could have gone in there, we went in there to use the computer Maya had installed, and it was gonna be installed, but we needed to begin testing as soon as possible. So,
Yeah, it's because the license, we just had one temporary license for RenderMan. We were gonna put it on one computer, we were gonna use it for that, and we wanted to start our testing before the computer in 346, because we did talk to Carlos Morales about that, before it was ready. Plus, I mean, like I said, we wanted to kind of focus on people maybe who didn't have access to big fancy computers and wanted to render fur, so.
but that would have
But a comparison study would be good.
If this is aimed at people who don't have big fancy computers to render fur, is it really worth shelling out $1,000 to get RenderMan to save you that extra time?
RenderMan is available to students for $200 license per year. So you can get it at, you know, a significant discount, V-Ray as well, if you decided you wanted to use those. It's just that, you know, then you're on a time crunch, you have it for 1 year, you have to pay again. So that's just another factor to look at. Whereas why we were focusing on Mental Ray is that it comes integrated in Maya, so you wouldn't have to worry about buying something different.
We looked at another render engine called 3D Delight, which is a RenderMan compliant render engine that works similar to Pixar's RenderMan. And you can get 1 free copy, but it puts limitations on how many cores you can render with, which affects the time it takes to render. So that kind of defeats the purpose. Though you can sell your work with that license. We did find that out.
Could you go back to your animated short really quickly?
Which one?
Just the first one. And you can just like pause it right there, but so does the blue and orange little guys, do they have fur on them?
Yes.
Dude.
It is hard to tell.
Okay. And you said your fox doesn't have fur on it. Why?
Working towards getting fur. Do you wanna?
Was it just like time?
It was, yeah, I UV unwrapped the fox and I was running into issues where when I applied the fur to it, you could see seams all over his body.
Okay.
So,
It wasn't a rendering of a fur issue, it was a building.
Do you have a
kind of.
Do you have still like comparison images of your different like characters with the different methods on them?
The characters?
Yeah.
We do not in this presentation.
Okay. Alright.
Sorry.
You should check out our website for that.
Oh,
Yeah.
whoa. That's a look, okay.
I was just wondering if you guys could go to the second video and that final clip where they're chasing the fox across the screen, if you could pause it where you have them in all three sections. I think you could see it a little bit better there.
Because, okay.
Even if you don't alter anything on the fur, RenderMan does render it out. It changes the color and it adds like scraggle to the fur.
Yeah.
Even though we didn't change any of the settings at all, that's one visual difference we noticed about the renders.
Seems to me that in the mental ray without passes, it seems to handle the specular highlights a little bit better on the fur than RenderMan does. And it's harder to tell between mental ray and the render passes. Could you back up to where maybe you have the green guy on the mental ray? Yeah, right there. I mean, you can see when he passes through into RenderMan, you can see his color darkens considerably. Is that caused by RenderMan changing the color, or is that because of the specularity settings changing?
I think it's because of the way RenderMan renders the shadows. You know, they have their own deep shadow. If you notice in the tests, it always appeared like the RenderMan fur was a bit darker, I thought.
Because here in this frame, I can see the speckly pink and purple guy in render passes, so I can see it's matching the specularity in color from mental ray. It's just got a different light angle. But there is clearly a difference now in between mental ray and RenderMan.
I mean, I don't want to let things down, but it could be because, you know, maybe that's something that we didn't adjust enough because we didn't understand the settings well enough.
I don't know if that necessarily requires adjustment. I'm just kind of, I guess, making an observation. I'm curious to know if that's because the lighting, is the specularity not showing up enough, or the color. I did notice a darker color on the furry balls earlier. So you're not sure if that's a specular highlighting issue or just a color correction issue?
Not sure.
If I had to guess, I would say it's
I'd say it's the shadows,
the way
but
the texture renders
shadows.
of the shadows, but it could be a specular issue.
So, rounding, your RenderMan numbers are generally about an order of magnitude faster. As someone who works in the software industry, that level of discrepancy speaks to not necessarily being a massive architecture difference, but literally a targeted hardware difference. Is RenderMan rendering on the video card and mental ray rendering on the CPU? If I'm a student with a limited budget, where should I be spending my dollars? Would a better video card get me a better render?
that's a good question.
Is it GPU or CPU?
Showing off the CPU. I believe it was rendering off the CPU, I'm not positive.
We're obviously kind of terrible at the technical side of things.
The hardware part.